Hi, I'm Ollie. Welcome to Possibility Space. Today I'm going to read you an explainer that I wrote. It's called, What's Wrong with the UK Ruling That Trans Women Aren't Women? The legal definition of a woman in the UK now excludes trans people. This is thanks to a Supreme Court ruling that defined sex as biological sex, meaning sex assigned at birth. This ruling has imposed severe restrictions on trans rights in the UK. This ruling means that trans women no longer have equal pay protection. Also, trans people can be excluded from all single-sex spaces in any situation. To illustrate its impact, let's imagine a day in the life of a British trans woman. Jennifer arrives at a job for which she's underpaid. She's greeted by her colleague, a man who's being paid twice as much as her to do the same job. Thanks to the Supreme Court, she's no longer entitled to bring an equal pay claim to remedy this. It's midday and she needs the toilet. Despite living as a woman for decades, she's now obliged to use the men's. She's tempted to use the gender-neutral toilets at a nearby coffee shop, but that will take half an hour out of her day and wages out of her pocket. She decides to brave it. A male colleague confronts her as she's washing her hands. What are you doing here? She's forced to out herself as trans. She can feel the eyes of her colleagues on her for the rest of the day. She walks into a meeting room. Everybody stops talking and looks sheepish. One of her colleagues stifles a laugh. Jennifer leaves the office at 6. She'd usually attend a support group for sexual assault survivors this evening. The man who chased her down a dark street didn't think to check her chromosomes before shouting sexual suggestions. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court reckoned their grounds to exclude her from the group now. Instead of giving and receiving support, she walks home alone. She passes a newsagent's and the front cover of the Daily Telegraph catches her eye. Trans women are not women, it bellows. The Supreme Court insisted in their ruling that, quote, it is not the role of the court to adjudicate on the arguments in the public domain on the meaning of gender or sex, nor is it to define the meaning of the word woman other than when it's used in the provisions of the Equality Act 2010. Nonetheless, this is what they've ruled. How did the court reach this decision? As you can see, this decision is terrible for trans people. Let's examine how the court reached such a damaging conclusion. First, by barring trans people from giving evidence. The judgment cites extensively from so-called gender-critical campaigners. By contrast, the court did not allow a single trans person to speak. An academic and a former judge, both trans, applied to speak before the court, but, without explaining why, the court flatly refused them. Regular listeners of this podcast will spot a parallel with the Cass Review. That's the document that the British government are using to justify curtailing transgender healthcare. Cass, the author of the Cass Review, specifically excluded, quote, subject matter experts and people with lived experience of gender services from her review's governance committee. This makes about as much sense as picking a rookie pilot because all of the seasoned captains displayed a suspicious bias towards altitude. In both cases, what we're seeing is ignorance by choice. The court also reached their decision by relying on narrow and conservative definitions of sex. In the public domain, that is, when you and I speak to each other, sex and gender are discrete concepts. In the legal domain, however, there's no distinction. For the purpose of the court, these two words mean the same thing. Many of the problems with this judgment stem from that flattening of language. The law fails to capture the lived reality of trans, non-binary, and intersex people. For example, the court offers a simple definition of biological sex. That definition is, quote, the sex of a person at birth. This means what's initially recorded on one's birth certificate, which can be wrong. Sex is notoriously difficult to define. This is because the components of biology considered to constitute sex sometimes conflict. So, assigning sex at birth is more about paperwork and assumption than real biology. This didn't trouble the court. Conflating sex and gender causes the court to misattribute misogyny to women's, quote, shared biology. This shifts the focus away from the real problem, women's shared oppression under patriarchy. It obscures a reality that trans women experience misogynistic discrimination as much, if not more than, many other women. The court also downplays the impact of its ruling on trans people. They insist in their judgment and in their public statements that trans people will not be disadvantaged by its decision. This does not appear to be accurate. Trans women can no longer file equal pay claims against male colleagues. Research shows that they earn much less than men and even less than their cisgender female colleagues. The court justified this on the basis that some trans men, being, quote, biologically female, may now bring equal pay claims citing male colleagues instead. Regarding equal pay protections, the court said, quote, a biological definition of sex would transfer this right from some trans women to some trans men. We do not see this difficulty as compelling a different conclusion in these circumstances. There are a few problems with this. A, quote, transfer of rights, by definition, harms the group losing the rights. The court tacitly admit this by referring to the transfer as a difficulty. Secondly, as anybody who knows about the gender pay gap will tell you, the problem is very rarely that men are paid less than women. Being able to claim on that basis is not, in practice, an equivalent right to being able to claim that you are being paid less than a man. The court says similar things about sports, but the reality is that all trans women are now automatically blanket banned from women's sports. Trans men are similarly blanket banned from men-only sports. The public body responsible for implementing these rules has suggested that trans people should seek out some undefined, quote, third space to use instead. Notably, they have not offered to advocate for suitable facilities for trans people, instead suggesting that trans people take on this brutal task all by themselves. The reality of this ruling is that trans people's rights have been reduced, both in theory and in practice. What are critics saying about this decision? The judgment is, by its author's own admission, an act of, quote, statutory interpretation. Many lawyers, legal researchers, former High and Supreme Court judges, and a former civil servant who was involved in drafting the act that the Supreme Court are now interpreting, found the court's interpretation unconvincing. Here are some reasons why. They ask, if Parliament intended to exclude trans people, why didn't they use the provision they put in place to do that? Section 9.3 of the Gender Recognition Act 2004 contains a loophole. It says that, if Parliament wants to, it can exclude the effect of the Act from any piece of legislation. The Equality Act 2010 was written after the Gender Recognition Act 2004, clues in the name, but it does not invoke Section 9.3. Despite this, the Supreme Court believes that Parliament intended to keep trans women out of the Equality Act's definition of a woman. The court said we must understand men and women as defined by their biology to decide if someone has faced discrimination due to pregnancy or sexual orientation. Therefore, it stated that understanding sex as biological sex was the right way to interpret the Equality Act overall. This leads to some pretty wacky conclusions, like denying the existence of trans lesbians. The court concluded that a lesbian must be a female who is sexually oriented towards or attracted to females. Trans women, they say, cannot be lesbians because that would make, quote, the concept of sexual orientation meaningless. The court also argues that acknowledging the existence of trans lesbians would lead to, quote, an inevitable loss of autonomy and dignity for lesbians. The vast majority of lesbians disagree, but that didn't trouble the court either. Last but certainly not least, the judgment does not appear to be compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. Some worry that the Supreme Court ruling isn't compatible with existing European Court of Human Rights rulings. The European Court ruled that placing trans people in a, quote, intermediate zone as not quite one gender or the other was a violation of their Article 8 rights to establish details of their identity and to have such identity respected. This was the ruling that made the British government, albeit begrudgingly, recognise the gender of trans people through the Gender Recognition Act 2004. The Supreme Court's ruling brings back this issue by viewing trans people as having different sexes for different purposes. For example, a trans woman can now be kept out of a woman's book club because she's apparently a man, and from a men's book club because she's trans. This double bind was applauded by gender-critical campaign group Sex Matters. Their founder said, "Not being allowed into the men's by rule does not mean you have the right to go in the ladies, and vice versa. This may seem unfair." She's right, it does seem unfair to me. But these are the life choices that people make. If you make extreme effort to look like a man, don't be surprised if you are denied entrance to ladies. The reason I'm giving column inches to Sex Matters, a transphobic hate group who promote harmful conversion therapies, is that the Supreme Court's ruling expresses, quote, particular gratitude to them. The court stated that they gave focus and structure to the argument that sex, man, and woman should be given a purely biological meaning. What happens now? We fight back. The Good Law Project has set up a fighting fund. They aim to challenge the ruling. Unfortunately, it will be a long time until we know the outcome. They must exhaust all domestic remedies prior to appealing to the European Court. The wheels of justice turn slowly. The wheels of injustice, on the other hand, they are spinning. Transphobes are already using this as a rallying point for further attacks, and the government is supporting them. The right-wing group Women's Safety Initiative, for example, have changed their focus from trans people to immigrants. Quote, "We've won the battle against trans ideology. Now it's essential that the gender-critical community speaks up about the dangers of mass migration for women." They're wrong. Research shows that immigrants are less likely to commit crime than natives. Despite this, the government is backing them by promising to publish a league table of foreign criminals. Elsewhere, Sex Matters are using the ruling as a pretext to curtail trans healthcare. Quote, "The entire premise of treatment with puberty blockers for gender dysphoria has fallen away. Passing as the opposite sex ceases to be a desirable goal to present to children when they will never be permitted to use spaces or services for the opposite sex." They're wrong as well. Trans people transition for reasons of health and well-being, not just recognition. Gender-affirming care is known to improve outcomes and save lives. Trans people won't stop being trans just because Sex Matters has decided to make their lives difficult. Sex Matters' shocking statement admits that although they claim to want to, quote, protect everyone's rights, their true aim is to push trans people out of public life. Despite this, the government is backing them by curtailing trans healthcare. Even the Prime Minister himself is getting in on the action, declaring that trans women are not women. This is simply wrong in law. The Supreme Court ruled that, for the Equality Act, sex should be defined biologically. However, the Gender Recognition Act still applies in most situations. Barrister Oscar Davies called Starmer's remarks, quote, disappointing from a former human rights lawyer. My description of Starmer's remarks is not fit to publish on this podcast. Trans people also now have to wait to see how much their rights have been reduced. Supreme Court rulings don't just change things immediately. First, we need to turn them into guidance for stakeholders, such as employers, service providers, and business owners. Stakeholders then modify their policies in response to that. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, EHRC, handles this. They issue guidance, but it's seriously undermined by the fact that its commissioners are political appointees. Liz Truss, for example, bragged that her appointees would counteract groupthink and virtue signalling. Both of these are far-right talking points. What this means is that trans people don't just suffer psychological blows on the day of the Supreme Court ruling. They suffer blow after blow, day in and day out, as the public realm is remade into an even more hostile environment for them. They wake, exhausted, to face headlines like, "Trans women to be strip-searched by male transport police after the UK court ruling." NHS to test all, quote, trans children for autism. Note they put trans in quotes there. And from The Sun, regarding women's football teams, they think it's all ovaries. It is now. Many questions regarding this ruling remain completely unanswered. Outside of the impact on the trans community, there are loads of practical concerns. Simple questions linger, like, can a father still take his daughter into the women's toilet? Or, can a mother take her son with her? Increased policing of bathrooms to check biological sex has a big impact. It disproportionately affects people like butch lesbians, who are often seen as not feminine enough. Stakeholders are reckoning with unworkable and unsafe guidance. Confusion reigns among politicians and policymakers. For example, the EHRC says that, quote, where possible, mixed-sex toilet washing or changing facilities, in addition to sufficient single-sex facilities, should be provided. However, this advice goes against government policy. They recently introduced building regulations to, quote, halt the march of gender-neutral toilets in buildings. It's a mess. Both parties seem determined to drive trans people out of public life, but they can't agree on how. Business owners are understandably frustrated by the mixed messages. They're also upset about being asked to spend millions to change their premises for what they see as, quote, a political issue that came out of nowhere. So what can we do to support the trans community? We can, and we must, protect the rights of all vulnerable groups without turning them against each other. Here's how. First, we make clear that no one is required to exclude trans people. The law says you now can, but there's no obligation to. Secondly, we support the Good Law Project's Fighting Fund. They're committed to appealing this ruling at the European Court of Human Rights. Thirdly, write to your MP. Ask that they give careful thought to how they want the Equality Act to operate in practice. This means properly scrutinising the EHRC's guidance, which is due in full this summer, asking why we allow political appointees to the EHRC in the first place, pressuring the government to keep their manifesto promise to, quote, modernise, simplify and reform the intrusive and outdated gender recognition law to a new process, remove indignities for trans people who deserve recognition and acceptance. Consult with the trans community, and you should ask them to draft a public statement to reassure the many scared trans people in our country that the government has their back. The Labour Party has a huge majority in Parliament, so what happens to trans people will be up to them. We won't allow them, as some of them have tried, to hide behind court rulings. They're the ones who make the laws that the courts interpret. The buck has to stop with them. Some Labour MPs are sticking up for their trans constituents. Others are mocking them and demanding that we pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights, lest it helps trans people. Most are just silent on the issue. Find out where your MP stands, and if it's not with you, withhold your vote. Acknowledgements. If you're trans and you're listening to this, I want you to know that I love you, and so do all of my friends. The people who brought this case to the Supreme Court do not want you to exist, but the joke's on them. Trans people have always existed, and they have survived much, much worse than this. This article would not exist without trans people. It is particularly indebted to Jess O. Thompson, whose tireless reporting on this subject is a triumph of reality over mystification. If you read this on the website, you've been clicking through to the citations in this article, then you've already read Jess's work. If you want more from Jess on this topic, you can catch her on the Take podcast or on my personal favourite, the Trash Future podcast. Thank you for listening. I hope that was helpful and informative and explanatory. Possibility Space, this podcast, is reader supported, I guess listener supported. You can subscribe on Substack, or you can subscribe through Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. See you next time.